Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia. Oh, look at Cambodia. European Union, they're very tough. Vietnam, India, very, very tough.
What they have done is they've taken the deficit as a percentage of the imports that the US does from that country. So US exports minus US imports divided by US imports.
India, very, very tough.
Well, it seems like it wasn't that tough after all. Trump tariffs, as promised by the US president, were announced with much fanfare at the White House, with countries being called out for apparently charging high tariffs on US products. Trump's response was half of what they were charging. Well, in most cases.
Prime Minister just left, and he's a great friend of mine, but I said, you're a friend of mine, but you're not treating us right. They charge us 52%.
Markets tumbled, as expected. But let's come to the more interesting part, which is quite puzzling, especially when it comes from a country which prides itself to be the most powerful and the richest country in the world. The tariff rates that the White House accuses countries of imposing on US goods do not add up. The figures floated by Trump match with another ratio derived from trade data, which doesn't align with what tariffs actually mean.
So it's 67%, so we're going to be charging a discounted reciprocal tariff of 34%. I think, in other words, they charge us, we charge them less.
The tariff rates presented by the Trump administration weren't actually based on real tariffs.
Rip us off. It's so sad to say. It's so pathetic.
Instead, they used a very basic formula that has nothing to do with actual trade barriers, tariffs, or currency movements. According to the US Trade Representative's website, they calculated these so-called tariff rates by dividing the US trade deficit with a country by the total imports from that country. So for India in 2024, the US had a trade deficit of $45.66 billion and imported goods worth Rs $87.42 billion. That gives a ratio of 0.52 or 52%, which they called India's tariff rate. Then they suggested a reciprocal tariff of half of that, about 27% on Indian goods.
39%, we're going to charge them 20%, so we're charging them essentially half.
How Trump came to this conclusion that India is charging US 52% tariff, and of course 26% has been levied on India now.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. People have worked out how they've arrived at the number that they're arriving at. What they have done is they've taken the deficit as a percentage of the imports that the US does from that country. So US exports minus US imports divided by US imports, right? And that number is a percentage. So deficit as a percentage of import, and then they have halved it. So the deficit with Vietnam, for instance, is 90% of US imports. So they've taken that 90% as the tariff rate, they've halved it, and they've applied 45% tariff on Vietnam. Similarly, the deficit with China. Yeah, exactly. So it's a very strange way of coming up with tariff rates. Nobody has ever done it before, but the US has decided under the Trump administration to go this route.
These numbers first appeared in the White House charts during a Trump press conference. They matched some independent calculations but didn't line up with the official document released later. In fact, Bloomberg found that for at least 14 countries, including India, the official document listed a rate that was 1 percentage point higher. The method used leads to bizarre results.
The problem is they charge us 90%. We're going to charge them 46% tariff.
For example, tiny countries like Lesotho or St. Pierre and Miquelon were shown as having a 99% tariff on US goods, just because the US barely exports to them but imports a little. On the flip side, if trade were perfectly balanced, the formula would show 0% tariff, no matter how much trade happens, which made no economic sense.
India's number is arrived at exactly the same. Every single country, except for countries where the US either does not have a trade deficit or has a trade surplus, and for those countries, they just applied a minimum 10%. So the lowest they go is 10%, And as you've seen, the highest they go is for Vietnam.